You think you can just walk all over us? You are wrong. This is not over.
Margaret Lawson's heels clicked sharply against the marble floor, echoing through the vast, cold lobby of Feneltech's headquarters. As she stepped into the towering glass building for the first time, the weight of the moment was not lost on her. This was it, the pinnacle. She had arrived, handpicked to lead one of the most powerful tech companies in the world. The air felt thinner here, as if even the building recognized the power it housed. She straightened her jacket, an expensive, perfectly tailored suit that fit her ambition as well as it fit her body. She was the future of Feneltech. The old ways, the outdated structure, those would all be gone soon. Everything she had worked for had led to this moment. Margaret was ready to reshape the company, to drive it forward with her vision. The office was her first stop. The double doors swung open to reveal the imposing space. Rich mahogany furniture, modern glass desks, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city stretched in every direction. But the true weight of the office lay in the history it carried. This was no ordinary space. This was the heart of Feneltech, the very place where it had all begun. Margaret walked in, her eyes scanning the room with purpose. Her fingers brushed the surface of the desk, still neatly arranged but somehow feeling foreign, like something that didn't belong to her yet. The polished wood reflected the light in sharp angles, as if it held stories of its own. Her hand tightened around a pen holder, an ornate piece she immediately planned to replace with something more fitting for her new era. The thought of David Fennell's legacy, the founder, the visionary, suddenly felt like a distant echo, one she could easily dismiss. To her, this was just an office, a space that needed fresh leadership. Her leadership. She turned to face the room, her voice cold but steady. "Get me the latest reports and make sure the team is ready for the changes we'll implement by next week. I'll be reworking the structure from the ground up," she ordered, her tone sharp like a scalpel. The staff, who had long been accustomed to David's thoughtful, hands-off leadership, flinched at her abruptness, but nodded obediently. Margaret felt a momentary surge of satisfaction as the team scattered, eager to obey. But as she stood there, surveying the space, something shifted in the air. A subtle, almost imperceptible weight pressed down on her shoulders. The office seemed different, as if something unseen was watching her. It wasn't the sterile modernity of the room, nor the reflection of her sharp, determined face in the glass. It was something deeper. She couldn't quite place it, but the space felt alive, haunted perhaps. Then the phone rang, the sharp sound cutting through the tension. Margaret picked it up, still staring at the desk, her hand resting lightly on its edge. Margaret Lawson. The voice on the other end was familiar, but not one she was prepared for. "This is David Fennell. I'm back. I'll be meeting with the board this afternoon. See you soon." The words landed like a punch. David Fennell, the man who built this company from nothing, the man who had led with quiet strength, the man whose presence she had just brushed aside. The phone slipped from her hand and landed on the desk with a soft thud. A cold chill washed over her, as if the office itself had just awakened. Someone was standing in her way. And Margaret, for the first time in her career, didn't feel so sure of her place. Her hand tightened around the edge of the desk. The man she had thought to overshadow was returning to claim his space, and that would change everything. David Fennell's footsteps echoed through the entrance of Feneltech's headquarters, a building he had once walked through with the thrill of new possibilities. Today, his gait was slower, more deliberate, each step weighed down by years of disappointment and struggle. His sharp eyes, though softened by time, still carried the fire of a man who had fought for everything. He didn't look like the young visionary who had built the company from the ground up. His suit was simple, without the flash of wealth or the pride of a conqueror. But his presence, unyielding and calm, was enough to make anyone pause. The walls he had once designed to embody his mission now stood with a cold, corporate sheen. The changes Margaret had implemented were visible everywhere. New hires, new systems, new faces. Feneltech had grown, but it felt different. Detached. David's eyes scanned the spaces where he had once made bold decisions. His decisions. The open plan offices, the huddle areas, the collaboration hubs, all designed to foster innovation and equality. It had been a home, A place where every employee, regardless of background, felt valued. Now it seemed sterile, corporate, as though the heart of the company had been replaced by glass and steel. The memory of his early days at Fennel Tech came rushing back like a tidal wave. The sleepless nights, the endless hustle. He'd built it all. Fennel Tech wasn't just another tech company. It was a symbol of what was possible for black excellence in an industry that had little room for people who looked like him. He remembered the countless calls with investors who doubted his vision, the way they subtly dismissed him because of his race, questioning if he could truly lead in a space dominated by people who didn't understand his struggle. But despite the friction, the doubts and the occasional racial slights, David had pushed forward. He built the company not just for profit, but for the dream of something bigger, a place where people of all backgrounds could come together, work together, and rise together. The pride he felt for his company was unmatched. Every new hire, every milestone was a small victory, not just for him, but for everyone who had believed in his vision. David paused in front of the CEO's office. The door was ajar. He could already feel it, the weight of the space, the sense of history. It wasn't just an office, it was a battleground, a place where his legacy had once thrived, only to be quietly replaced. As he walked in, the atmosphere shifted. The temperature seemed to drop. The air became heavier, filled with unspoken tension. Margaret Lawson stood at the desk, her posture rigid, ready to assert her control. But as David entered, the energy in the room changed. He didn't need to say a word for the weight of his presence to be felt. Margaret, who had so confidently assumed the throne, now found herself unsure. The room was silent, a momentary pause hanging between them. Margaret, caught off guard by the shift, finally spoke. "David," she said, her voice steady but thin with an edge of uncertainty. "I'm glad you're here. We need to talk about the direction of the company." David's response was calm, his voice low but firm. "I'm not here to talk about the direction of the company, Margaret. I'm here to remind you that this is my company." The words lingered in the air, unspoken but undeniable. Margaret, her mind racing, wasn't sure how to respond. The power shift she had anticipated now seemed fragile, as if the very foundation beneath her was shifting. This wasn't just a battle for control, it was a reckoning, and David was ready for it. The chapter ends with a lingering sense of tension. Margaret stands firm, but she knows deep down, the real battle has just begun. David Fennel's eyes never left Margaret as she stood to greet him. Her hand extended toward him in a professional gesture, but he did not move to take it. The space between them felt heavier than it should have been. Margaret's smile faltered for the briefest moment, but she quickly recovered, her hand hanging awkwardly in the air before she withdrew it. David didn't need to make any grand gestures. His silence was enough. He surveyed the room, the office he had once lived and breathed in. It wasn't his office anymore. It had been stripped of his vision, his energy. The walls, once adorned with the ideas he had nurtured, were now bare. The furniture, cold, sleek, modern, felt foreign to him. It was a space that didn't belong to him, yet still carried his name. Margaret gestured toward the chair across from her desk, a weak attempt at hospitality, but David remained standing. His posture was unshakable, as though the very act of sitting would concede something he was not ready to give. He folded his arms in front of him, not out of defiance but of quiet, commanding certainty. There was no rush to fill the silence. "This is my company," David said, the words cutting through the stillness with calm intensity. They weren't words of anger but of ownership, of a legacy that refused to be erased. Margaret's eyes narrowed. She had worked tirelessly for this. Her ambition had led her here. Years of climbing, proving herself in a world that often tried to shut her out. And now she was standing in the center of it all. This was supposed to be her moment, the crowning achievement of her career. But as David spoke, something inside her shifted. Her lips parted to say something, anything to defend her place, but the words dried up in her throat. She had expected a challenge, perhaps even some resistance. But this felt different. His words didn't just take space in the room. They filled it, pushing her confidence into a corner. She had anticipated a battle over numbers, over results, over strategy. But David wasn't fighting her over that. He was fighting for something much deeper, his legacy. She could feel the tension building between them, the weight of their wills pressing down on each other. Margaret straightened, trying to recover some ground. "You've had your time, David," she said, her voice steady but not quite convincing. "This is a new era. The company has to move forward." David didn't respond immediately. He simply stood there, his gaze locked on her, studying her. He didn't need to explain the depth of his connection to Feneltech. She could see it in the quiet determination of his eyes. He wasn't just reclaiming an office. He was reclaiming a piece of himself that had been lost, erased in a system that had never fully accepted him. For the briefest moment, Margaret felt something she wasn't used to: vulnerability. It wasn't fear exactly, but a subtle shift in power that she hadn't expected. In this room, surrounded by everything she had fought for, she realized that her battle wasn't just with David for control of the company, it was for something far more personal. She hadn't just taken his office. She had tried to rewrite the story of Feneltech. David spoke again, his voice quieter now but no less powerful. "I didn't build this company to make money, Margaret. I built it to change lives, to prove that someone who looks like me can succeed in a world that would rather silence us." The words landed like a weight, heavy and unyielding. Margaret swallowed, her throat dry. This wasn't just about business anymore. This was a fight for identity, for history, and for the future. It was about more than who held the title of CEO. It was about who had the right to claim this company as their own. David's gaze didn't waver. For a split second, Margaret's confidence faltered. The walls she had built around her own story began to crack. She had never imagined a world in which she felt like an intruder in her own success. David's eyes never left hers, and in that moment, Margaret knew that this was no ordinary battle. It was one she had not been prepared for. The chapter closed with the room filled with an unsettling silence, the future of Feneltech hanging in the balance. The boardroom doors closed with a soft click, but the weight of the conversation inside hung thick in the air. The scene flickered, shifting from the present back into the shadowy past. In the dim light of the conference room, David Fennell sat at the head of the table, his fingers pressed lightly against the smooth surface of the wood. His team, diverse and driven by his vision, gathered around him, their eyes full of respect and trust. But behind the polished facade of Feneltech's success, an unease had begun to take root. The board, once David's strongest ally, had started to shift. They whispered among themselves, their words too soft to hear, but their intentions clear. As Feneltech's global influence grew, so did their discomfort. It was no longer just about innovation. It was about control. The numbers were good, but the real power was beginning to slip out of their hands. In the back corner of the room, a board member leaned in, speaking in a voice barely above a whisper. "Perhaps David's vision has become too personal," he said, his tone laced with a subtle critique. "Too focused on his own agenda. We need someone who can move this company forward in a more traditional way." Another member seated beside him nodded slowly. The whispers grew louder, spreading like a contagion. The language of tradition and polished leadership filled the space, but David felt it all. The invisible shift, the silent betrayal. They weren't talking about leadership anymore. They were talking about control. The board had stopped seeing him as the visionary who had built Feneltech. Instead, they saw a man who no longer fit the mold of a CEO in their eyes. His race had become the subtext, the unspoken reason they no longer felt comfortable with him in charge. David clenched his jaw, watching the scene unfold in his mind. The memory still burned, but now he saw it for what it truly was: a quiet coup. Not a battle for competence or capability, but for something deeper, something they couldn't admit. He wasn't just a threat to the status quo. He was a symbol of change that many in the room were unwilling to accept. In the flashback, the votes had been cast. A new face had appeared, someone with the right polish, someone who could be controlled, who could push Feneltech forward without shaking up the established order. Margaret Lawson had arrived. Her profile was perfect for the job, someone fresh, someone who could appease the board while masking the deeper discomfort they had with David's leadership. David's heart tightened as he watched the scene play out. The betrayal wasn't just professional, it was personal. They had taken everything from him, not because he wasn't capable, but because his success was a reminder of the power structures that kept certain people out. His race, his background, those had been silent factors in their decision to replace him. He remembered the late-night calls with investors, the ones who smiled and nodded but never really understood his vision. The silent frustrations, the barely veiled comments, the whispers behind his back. David had always known that his journey would be different, harder, but the sting of betrayal by those he trusted most was something he couldn't prepare for. Now, as the flashback faded, David stood once more in the present, his face set with determination. He had been replaced, yes, but he hadn't been defeated. This fight wasn't just about reclaiming Feneltech. It was about something much larger. It was about taking back what was rightfully his, not just for himself, but for every black entrepreneur who had ever been silenced in a room like this. His fingers curled into a fist as he looked toward the future. He wasn't done yet. The board had underestimated him, and that was a mistake they would soon regret. The chapter closed, the promise of what was to come hanging in the air like the calm before a storm. The room was thick with tension. The soft hum of the air conditioning was the only sound, cutting through the heavy silence. David stood at the edge of the office, his back straight, hands clenched at his sides. Margaret sat behind the desk, her fingers tapping rhythmically on the wood, her posture stiff. The two of them were locked in an invisible battle, each holding on to their own truth with unyielding force. "I'm here to lead, David," Margaret said, her voice steady but charged with frustration. "This company needs to move forward. We need to modernize, innovate, become the global powerhouse we were meant to be. The world's changing, and Feneltech can't afford to stay stuck in the past." David's eyes narrowed. He had heard these words before, corporate buzzwords, slick arguments made to hide the deeper agenda. This company was never about just profits, Margaret. It was about empowerment, about creating a space where people, especially people like me, could thrive in a world that told us we didn't belong, he said, his voice firm but calm. "What you're doing is more than just modernizing. You're erasing the very foundation this company was built on." Margaret's jaw tightened, but she refused to back down. "The foundation you built doesn't fit anymore, David. The market's changed. The people are different. I'm here to take this company to the next level, to help it grow beyond what you ever dreamed of." She leaned forward, the sharp edges of her words cutting through the room. "I'm not here to tear down your legacy. I'm here to improve it." David took a step forward, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "You don't get it. You never will. Feneltech was never just about the numbers. It was about legacy. It was about the people who trusted me, the ones who believed that they too could make something of themselves in a world that would rather shut them out. You think modernizing means progress, but it's just another way to silence those who built this place." Margaret froze. His words hit her harder than she expected. She had come into this battle with a plan, but now, in the heat of the confrontation, she was forced to question her own motives. She knew what she wanted, but did she really understand why? "I'm afraid of failing, David," she admitted, her voice softer now, tinged with vulnerability. "I'm afraid that I'm just another token hire, that they picked me because I look the part. I don't want to be seen as a placeholder, as someone who doesn't belong." Her eyes met his, searching for understanding. David's expression softened, but his tone remained resolute. "You'll never truly lead, Margaret, until you understand what it means to carry the weight of history. To see the roots of power, to understand the struggle that came before you. Feneltech wasn't just built on ambition. It was built on the blood, sweat, and dreams of people who had to fight for everything. You can't change it unless you acknowledge that." Margaret looked down, her hands trembling slightly as they rested on the desk. She had always been the one pushing for change, for progress. But now, standing here, facing the man who had built this company from nothing, she wasn't sure if she had ever truly understood the cost of that change. She had focused on the future, but at what cost? The silence between them stretched, thick and heavy, like the air before a storm. Margaret's mind raced, trying to form a response, trying to find a way to reconcile her vision with his. But in that moment, she didn't have the words. For the first time since she'd stepped into this office, she felt small. She didn't know if she could win this battle. David watched her closely, his expression unreadable. He had seen her confidence falter, and for a brief moment he saw something in her eyes, something human, something real. But he didn't offer her sympathy. He offered her truth. Margaret straightened in her chair, her gaze hardening. She would not back down, but deep inside she knew that the fight had just changed. The power dynamic had shifted, and she no longer knew if she was ready for what was to come. David's words lingered in the room, a reminder that the battle they were fighting wasn't just for control of a company, it was for something deeper. Something far more personal. The chapter ended with a cold silence, the future uncertain. Margaret knew the game had changed, but she didn't know if she had what it took to win. Margaret Lawson sat at her desk, the sterile hum of the office around her only amplifying the growing noise in her mind. The weight of it all pressed down on her chest, the board's eyes on her, the expectation to deliver results, and David's ever-present shadow looming over her. His return had disrupted everything, unraveling the careful plans she had set in motion. David, once the founder, was now working quietly but effectively with key executives. It wasn't loud or brash, it didn't need to be. But his influence was unmistakable. He had a way of reminding people of their loyalty to the company, to its original vision, and they responded. They rallied to his side, some even dropping their new responsibilities to follow his lead. In the spaces where he had once led, there was now a return to his ways, a way Margaret found difficult to penetrate. She tried, desperately, to assert her authority. Meetings, emails, discussions with the board, they were all part of the strategy she had drawn up. But each attempt felt hollow, like an echo of something she had once dreamed of. She was supposed to be the one with the answers, the one who could push Fenneltech to new heights. But every time she tried to push forward, she found herself stifled by the weight of the past. David was everywhere, in the halls, in the conversations, in the decisions made in quiet rooms. He wasn't just an obstacle. He was a reminder of everything she was fighting against. Internally, Margaret was caught in a struggle far more intense than anything she had expected. She had fought her whole career to break free from the mold, to prove that she could lead without having to fit into the neat boxes others had for her. But here, in this seat of power, the mold seemed impossible to escape. The board, the executives, and the company's very culture pressed on her, forcing her into a shape she never intended to wear. Her vision for Fenneltech, her dream of innovation, clashed with the reality of a company deeply rooted in tradition. The system was stubborn. The company's history was built on a foundation she couldn't ignore, and David's presence only reminded her of how deep those roots ran. She could try to undermine him, subtly, in ways that no one else could see, but she knew it wouldn't be enough. Every move she made was transparent. The executives saw her as someone trying to fight against the tides, someone who hadn't truly earned their loyalty. In the quiet moments of the day, when the office was still and empty, Margaret would retreat into her mind, torn between her desire to prove herself and the realization that she was losing control. She couldn't change the company's culture overnight, but the board demanded immediate results. They wanted to see progress, and fast. And yet, no matter how hard she tried, every initiative felt like an uphill battle, every decision a compromise. That evening, in the solitude of her office, Margaret stared at a photograph on her desk. It was an old picture of her from years ago, before she had climbed this high. In it, she was younger, full of ambition and hope, standing tall and proud as if the world was hers to conquer. She picked it up, her fingers trembling slightly as she traced the edges of the photograph. That woman in the picture seemed so certain, so sure of her future. But now, staring at the image, Margaret couldn't help but feel the loneliness that had crept into her life. This office, these walls, the expectations, they had all come with a cost. The woman in the photo had been driven by hope, but the woman she had become felt weighed down by the very things she had fought for. For the first time in a long time, Margaret felt a deep uncertainty. The game had changed, and she wasn't sure if she had the strength to play it anymore. The photograph, once a symbol of her ambition, now felt like a reminder of all she had lost in this battle for control. The chapter closed in silence, with Margaret still holding the photo, lost in the weight of her own reflection. The road ahead was unclear, but one thing was certain. The battle for Fenneltech was far from over. The door to the CEO's office closed with a finality that echoed in the silence between them. David Fennell and Margaret Lawson sat across from each other, the weight of their conflict pressing down, like a storm about to break. The room, once a symbol of ambition and power, now felt small, suffocating, as if it were shrinking with each passing moment. Margaret's back was straight, but her hands trembled slightly on the polished surface of the desk. She was no longer the confident, calculated leader she had once been. She had tried with all her might to make this company hers, to shape it into what she thought it should be. But now, every decision, every move she made seemed to collapse around her. The walls, once standing tall with her authority, had started to crumble. David, on the other hand, remained calm, measured, his posture relaxed, but his presence undeniable. His years of experience had prepared him for this moment. He had built Fennell Tech not just to succeed, but to empower, to give a voice to those who had always been silenced in a world that favored a certain type of leadership. And Margaret, in her pursuit of proving herself, had overlooked what made the company truly strong. "I'm not here to make demands, Margaret," David said, his voice steady, carrying the weight of every decision he'd made to get to this point. "I'm here to remind you of what this company stands for. It's not just about profits or power or control. It's about giving a place to those who have always been told they don't belong." Margaret swallowed hard. She had thought that if she could just make the numbers work, if she could prove that she could lead this company forward, that she would be accepted. But now, as David spoke, she realized how deeply she had misunderstood the true heart of Fennell Tech. David leaned forward, his eyes not just seeing her, but seeing the struggle within her. "You've spent your whole life fighting to prove yourself in a system that wasn't built for people like you," he continued. "But that's the problem, Margaret. You're so focused on fitting into a system that you've forgotten the very reason this company was created." Margaret's chest tightened. His words hit harder than any of the battles she had fought in the boardroom. She had always felt the need to prove herself, to show that she belonged, to break free from the confines of her role as a woman in a man's world. But in doing so, she had lost sight of the very things that had made her want this position in the first place. David's voice softened, but the weight of his next words landed with brutal clarity. "I didn't build this company for you to succeed in the way you think success looks. I built it for the ones who had no chance at all, who didn't have the privilege of a fair fight." The room grew heavy as Margaret's mind raced, trying to grasp the enormity of what he was saying. She had built her identity on being able to lead, to prove that she was capable, that she was the right choice for this role. But what if the real question wasn't about capability? What if it was about understanding the responsibility that came with this kind of leadership? David gave her a choice. "Step down with dignity," he said quietly. "Walk away knowing that you've made your mark. Or stay and watch everything you've built fall apart. You won't survive here if you don't understand what this company truly stands for." The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Margaret stared at him, at the calm resolve in his eyes, and for the first time since taking this position, she saw the truth. The company wasn't about fitting into a mold. It was about breaking it, and she had spent so much time trying to fit in, she had forgotten that. A wave of realization crashed over her, and with it, a sense of surrender. Margaret knew she couldn't continue pretending that this was just about her career, her ambitions. She had to decide whether she would truly lead, or whether she would bow to the pressures of a system that never had room for her in the first place. The chapter closed as Margaret stood up slowly, her fingers curling around the back of the chair. The decision was hers, but she was no longer certain of what it would mean. One thing was clear, though. The journey ahead was no longer just about leadership. It was about identity, and the cost of truly understanding it. The boardroom was quiet, the air thick with the weight of decisions that had been made. David Fennell stood at the head of the table, his hands resting firmly on the surface in front of him. The chair that once seemed too large for him, too unfamiliar, now felt right again. David had reclaimed his position as CEO, but not through force or anger. His return wasn't a victory to be shouted from the rooftops. It was a quiet, deliberate act, like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples across the company. The old guard, the ones who had replaced him out of comfort rather than conviction, now found themselves sidelined. They were dismissed not with malice but with purpose. David's hand wasn't heavy, but it was certain. He wasn't interested in revenge. He was interested in progress. He had fought for this company to stand for more than just profit. It was meant to be a beacon for those who had been pushed to the edges, those whose voices had been silenced by systems that sought to stifle them. In the halls of Fennel Tech, where once the undercurrent of discontent had lingered, there was now a sense of direction, a pulse of purpose. The company that David had built was back on track, but this time, there was something new, a quiet determination to build on the legacy he had created, to continue the fight for equity, for opportunity, for people who had long been told they didn't belong. He would move forward, but never forgetting where it all began. Margaret, standing outside the boardroom in the quiet of the office hallway, watched it all unfold. Her heart, once filled with the fire of ambition, now felt something else, a deeper understanding. She had fought for her place at the table, for the chance to lead, to prove that she could take Fennel Tech into the future. But in the end, her ambition had been driven by something that went beyond the company's goals. It had been about fitting into a mold that wasn't hers to fill. The board had wanted someone to fit their vision. David had built something bigger, something that Margaret hadn't fully understood until now. In the weeks following the confrontation, something shifted within her. Margaret wasn't defeated in the way she had imagined. Instead of fighting for a place she no longer wanted to belong to, she found peace in embracing a new role. It wasn't the CEO's chair she had fought for, but the opportunity to truly contribute. Margaret's leadership potential hadn't gone unnoticed. David had seen that in her, even when she hadn't seen it in herself. She took on a new role within the company, one that respected both her skills and the need for change. She was no longer a token hire, but an integral part of the company's future. David, walking through the familiar halls of Fennel Tech, felt the shift too. The company had been through a storm, and though the storm wasn't over, it had passed. He knew the road ahead would not be easy, but it was his road to walk. The staff that had once been divided now moved together, their eyes focused on the mission ahead. They believed in the company's vision, in what it could become. For the first time in years, David felt a sense of ease. He had reclaimed more than just his position. He had reclaimed Fennel Tech's legacy, the soul of what it stood for, and ensured it would continue to thrive. David paused in the hallway, his eyes briefly scanning the faces around him. There was work to be done, but for a moment he allowed himself a quiet victory. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The foundation of Fennel Tech had been restored, and for the first time David could breathe easy, knowing that the company's legacy was in safe hands. The company was not just his to lead, it was theirs to build. The chapter closed with David walking forward, his steps steady, as the company moved forward too. The story was far from finished, but in this moment, it felt like they were finally on the right path. The glass doors of Fennel Tech slid open with a soft hum, a familiar sound David had heard countless times before. But today it felt different. Today there was no grand celebration, no loud fanfare. The company was quieter, more focused, as if it had found its center again. David walked through the halls, his steps deliberate, the weight of leadership heavy on his shoulders, but lighter than it had been in years. Fennel Tech was no longer the company it had been when he left it. It had evolved, reshaped by the struggles, the victories, and the lessons learned along the way. Under David's leadership, it was moving forward, but not without acknowledgement of the challenges ahead. The world was changing faster than ever, and David knew the fight for equity, for true representation, was far from over. Yet for the first time in a long time, he saw the potential for something truly lasting. His eyes scanned the employees around him, many of whom had once been just faces in the crowd. Now, they were part of the vision he had always dreamed of, a company that was more than just a business, but a place that empowered everyone, regardless of their background. The diversity of voices, of perspectives, felt like the heartbeat of Fennel Tech, and David knew that it was this very strength that would carry the company through whatever came next. Margaret, too, had found her place. She wasn't leading the company, not in the way she had once hoped, but she was growing into a role that allowed her to contribute without overshadowing what had already been built. She had learned that leadership wasn't about control. It was about understanding the balance between personal ambition and collective progress. In her new role, Margaret didn't just see the company through her own lens anymore. She saw it through the lens of history, the struggles that David had faced, the legacy that was his, and how her own journey could now align with that story. The road ahead was hers to shape, but it was no longer a road of individual triumph. It was a road of collaboration, of respect for what had been, and the lessons that came with it. She had begun to understand that true leadership didn't erase the past. It built on it, using every lesson learned to create a better future. The company, once again, had become a place where voices could rise, where diversity could thrive, and where the legacy of Feneltech would be protected while also evolving. David walked through the halls, his eyes meeting the faces of those who had once doubted him, but who now stood beside him. He saw not just employees, but individuals, each contributing to the bigger picture. As David sat in his office staring out at the city skyline, he reflected on the long road that had brought him here. The fight for equity, identity, and legacy was far from finished. There would be more battles, more struggles. But in this moment, David knew that the foundation had been set. The future of Feneltech would not be built on the mistakes of the past, but on the lessons learned, the voices heard, and the understanding that true progress could only come when every person was given the chance to rise. Margaret stood by the window in her office, looking out at the same skyline. The weight of the company's history was still with her, but now it was a part of her own journey. The battle for self-discovery was just beginning, but the path ahead was clearer than it had ever been. The story of Feneltech, of David, of Margaret, wasn't over. It was just the beginning of something greater. They had fought for a future that honored the past, and now, that future was theirs to build.